The woman caught in the act of adultery is somewhat of a familiar story to many of us, although I have to wonder how often we stop to ask questions about this woman, about what was going on, about how she found herself in that position. Jeff, I need you to click the second screen for me. You know, this woman, in that culture, it is at least possible that she found herself in that situation by no fault or choice of her own. Possible. Perhaps not likely, but possible. Have we ever asked questions about the situation that she came from? Who she was? Did she ever suffer abuse? Was she desperately looking for love? Was her husband not providing for her? And of course, it tells us that this woman was caught in the act of adultery, which for me raises questions about the catchers. Why were they there? Where was it? Yeah, never mind, Do we wonder about when someone does something wrong? Do we ever ask questions about why? Not to excuse it, but to understand it. In India, for thousands of years, there was a very set system known as the caste system. Have you heard of this? Now, in 1949, the Constitution of India was adopted, and there's been development since then. And pretty much since then, it has been, quote, illegal to have a caste system where there are certain socioeconomic classes from which you cannot move. But whether or not it's still in play depends on who you ask. It's a little bit like, not exactly, but it's a little bit like the Civil Rights Act here in the United States. It's been on the books for 50 years, but in some places it still don't matter, right? It's a little bit like that. In the caste system, there were 4 castes, and a lot of it had to do with who you were born to, what kind of job you had, and your socioeconomic status. But there was a 5th group below caste. They did not have a caste. They did not have a place. They are sometimes known as the untouchables. Dalit is one word that you hear from one language. It literally means oppressed and downtrodden. It's actually a word that some of the people have adopted for themselves with pride. That's how that happens sometimes. Baptist used to be a pejorative word. They used to say that to tease those baptizers. Now we're like, Baptists, Same thing. Dalit, some of them have adopted a name for themselves. There's also Asprusya, meaning untouchable. In this system, especially when it was legal, and now when they're finding that you can't totally reverse the effects of thousands of years and 50 years, in that system, the Dalit could not access the wells, could not access education, had no access to public office, had no access to the temples. Pretty much anything you can think of, the people were cast out. Why? Pretty much because they were born into the wrong family. That was the reason. And so, but you have all these people in a country that's vastly populated. One of the most densely populated countries, if I remember correctly, in the world. Millions and millions of people who still live with a legacy of not having the same access as other people because of how they were born. And so it's interesting. You have a story like the woman caught in adultery who did something for which she could probably have understandable guilt. But then other people all over this world, including people like the Dalit, who may live with a sense of guilt and shame for something that was beyond their control. And part of the message for today is that no matter what, where you find yourself, class-wise, color-wise, country-wise, God is working in you from the inside out. In 2 Corinthians, Paul wrote, "Therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day." Do you ever feel like you're wasting away outwardly? And do you ever wish that people knew more about you than just what they can see? Do you ever make a mistake or lose your temper and wish that maybe some people who happen to be there, you wish and hope that they knew more about you than what there is to see? So much of how we work is outside in. We decorate our houses a certain way and our lawns a certain way to give a certain image. We dress a certain way. Sometimes we're made to feel one way or the other depending on whether we have this or that, whether we have a ring on our finger. That's a big one. You know, if you don't have a ring on your finger, sometimes there's all these people trying to set you up, right? We work so much from the outside in, both on ourselves and in what we try to change about ourselves and in what we see about other people. These scriptures tell us that we have a God who is working from the inside out, starting with the things that many other people may not even know about. I think often about the people who make the news because of something they did, a moment of indiscretion, a mistake, a crime, and that moment is captured on video forever for people to criticize and balk at and all of this. And then if I take enough time to think, I realize that I would be in the same position if my moments were also on camera, right? Like, I'm lucky enough that most of my moments don't show up on the evening news. Don't we always wish that people knew more than the snapshot? And do we have any desire to know more about other people than the snapshot? How the yard looks, what socioeconomic class they come from, what their race or culture is. The scripture says, Paul wrote, that we have this treasure in jars of clay. They had these clay jars that they kept many things in, and many of them were plain, and you couldn't tell what was in one from the other. You know, they didn't have the labels and the things that we have today. Just clay jars. But sometimes they contain something very valuable. In some instances, you weren't really going to get the contents out unless you broke it open. The clay jar. We so often are not able to break it open, to see what lies beneath, to understand what led up to the point where we find ourselves, what led up to the point where we pick up the story. You know, Caedmon's Call wrote that song, Mother India, largely because they met so many people that society and the government did not care about who had a tremendous story, some who had a painful story, some who had an upbringing that they were struggling to get beyond. And so they wrote those words, that they found God in India and found that they were caught in His embrace there, along with all of those other unseen, according to some, untouchable people. As one saying goes, if you judge a book by its cover, you might miss an amazing story. There's a little quote that's been going around online this week that I found. It says this: the true mark of maturity is when somebody hurts you and you try to understand their situation instead of trying to hurt them back. You know, the whole story of the gospel is that God does understand our situation and will not hurt us back. That's what God does. And when Jesus came, that's what he called us to do. You know, this trying to understand someone instead of taking the easy way out and saying, you know, they're nothing, throw them away, they don't belong here. Understanding is part of loving your neighbor as yourself, and this part about not trying to hurt them back is what we call forgiveness. And it's where we have to start to be able to understand what the treasure is. So much of what people do, so much of what they have or don't have, may just be the clay jar. What's inside? What's inside of you? Do you believe that you are better than the worst thing you have ever done? Because God does. In Psalm 130 it said this, "If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand?" And in Romans, Paul answered that question very plainly. He said, "No one is righteous, no, not one." The answer is, no one could stand if God kept a record of wrongs. But he is working in us from the inside out. The last verse of the Caedmon's Call song said, "There's a land where our shackles turn to diamonds, where we trade in our rags for a royal crown. In that place, our oppressors hold no power, and the doors of the King are flung wide." Flung wide, ready and open to receive us with all of our faults, all of our mistakes, all of our past. There is a God who looks at us, who looks at the people of India, who looks at the people all over the world, and knows that there is a treasure. And the challenge for us is to recognize the same, that even somewhere in the worst of the worst, there is a person that can be redeemed, because we all are God's children.